Thank you, everybody. Welcome to the Food for Thought for Sanctuaries talk with the Open Sanctuary Project. My name is Serene, and I am with P.E.A.C.E Canada, or we're situated in BC, Canada. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm so grateful to the team of the Open Sanctuary Project for coming on and doing these talks. Last week they did a talk on So You Want to Start a Sanctuary, and that is now available on our YouTube as well as on their website on the resources for starting a sanctuary. I think we're good to start. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the team. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you again for hosting us. We had a great time last week, and hopefully we can provide some interesting conversation this week. So thank you everybody for taking your time out of your Sunday to attend this talk. This conversation is intended for existing sanctuaries, rescues, and animal caregivers. And we hope that you take away some information that's helpful or maybe spark some new ideas for your organization. We here talking are the staff of the Open Sanctuary Project. I'm Z Griffler. I'm the executive editor of the Open Sanctuary Project. And I have two other staff members with me.
I'm Amber Barnes, and I'm the research specialist.
And I'm Tara Hess. I'm the senior advisor here.
So we're going to go over a lot of diverse topics, kind of spanning. We'll talk about those in a second. But as I said in the chat window, if anyone has any questions or comments or things they'd like us to address, please feel free to put them in the chat. We will do our best to address them. And if we don't talk about them at the beginning or throughout, we'll make time at the end to answer any questions that we can. So without further ado, food for thought for sanctuaries. So today we are going to talk about a few things, and we are going to talk about capacity considerations, so responsible capacity and some of the benefits of responsible capacity, creative ways to fundraise, or specifically like a couple different interesting approaches that some sanctuaries have taken that have worked really well for them, enrichment as basic care, which is a topic that's very dear to us, and animal-centered design, the basics of this really exciting topic in creating like really great living spaces for residents and how you can get started at whatever scale you need to. So what is capacity? This very first topic that we're going to talk about, if you haven't heard us talk about it before, it's extremely important to us. Capacity is really critical that all sanctuaries always keep in mind because it determines how many residents you can really provide responsible, individualized care to. Like this slide says, capacity is a lot more than a sanctuary's physical space. Every single organization that works directly with animals will need to think really carefully about the variables of capacity. And these variables can change completely independently of one another. They can change week to week, month to month. They can even change day to day. So it's really important to always keep these different variables in mind when you're thinking about whether you have the capacity to be providing care to additional residents is usually where people think about capacity and whether they have it. So let's talk a bit about the variables of capacity. So as we said, it's not just space, but space is a really big one, because if you don't have space for residents and you don't have individual spaces within living spaces for residents, you probably don't have capacity to take on additional residents on a permanent basis. But on top of spatial capacity, you also have quarantine capacity. So when you bring new residents in and you need to make sure that they are not going to be spreading anything to other residents, you need to make sure that you have a space that you can make a quarantine space. It doesn't necessarily have to be a dedicated quarantine space at all times, but that can be a great thing to have as well. Do you have the personnel capacity? Do you, or if you have a staff or you have volunteers, do you have the bandwidth mentally and both in terms of time to actually be providing care? Because if you can't be providing that daily care, how can you possibly be bringing additional residents in and trying to make that work, especially on a permanent basis? Financial capacity. Funding is just one of the biggest variables in being able to responsibly run a sanctuary. So looking at what you've already committed to in terms of residents and providing them individualized care. Do you have the financial capacity not only to provide daily basic care, but also if you say yes to a resident who might be in pretty strong need of veterinary care, do you have a budget to take care of them and give them what they need? Regulatory capacity is something that I think, unless you really started to have a sanctuary, this one can really trip up a lot of organizations, which is, how well do you know your zoning restrictions? And are you aware of if there's any limitations on specific species, numbers, sometimes even just the weight of all your residents combined is a zoning capacity boundary. So it's really important to be well aware of everything that you can and cannot do in terms of regulation at your sanctuary. And finally, emergency response capacity. If, every single location around the world will have different things that come to mind when you think of an emergency that could happen at your sanctuary. And that could be both things like environmental emergencies, but they could also, there's all sorts of things that can happen. And if you don't have the capacity to safely deal with that and provide care to your residents at really critical times, then it's really important to think about that as whether you truly have enough capacity to bring additional residents on. So why is capacity important? I think hopefully we've kind of covered that, there's a lot of really dire things can happen if capacity is exceeded, but it's also important, we thought, that we focus on the good of capacity and why it's really great to provide a space for your residents that is well within your capacity. And there's a lot of reasons why maintaining a really, a responsible capacity is really important. And so, having responsible capacity means that individualized care goes up because you have more time and you have more resources for each individual at your sanctuary. You can better evaluate the living spaces and the enrichment strategies for every individual and whether they're actually working for everybody. Because again, you have more time, you have more resources, and you can really devote that individualized care to the next level. You can make sure that everyone working at your sanctuary, including yourself, but also if you've got staff or volunteers, do they have a more manageable workload? And can you help provide more bandwidth for for your staff and make sure that you're keeping the risk of burnout lower? And can you help other organizations in your area because you have the capacity that you might be able to lend a hand, whereas otherwise, if you're really reaching the end of your capacity, you might not be able to be quite as helpful to other organizations. So this is an important point. Just because you might decide that your organization is at capacity, and frequently most sanctuaries are at capacity or getting pretty close to capacity, that doesn't mean that you can't be helpful to an animal in need. So if you're at capacity, you could still do things like assisting with transportation. You probably have the skill set and you might have the equipment that if you know that, for instance, maybe there's a horse in need and you know that there's a really good forever home for them, you can help coordinate that. You can offer temporary housing. So for instance, maybe a different sanctuary is working on a really important rescue, but they might not have the full quarantine capacity that you do. And maybe you can offer that on a temporary space. Or for instance, maybe just for whatever reason, an animal just needs to live somewhere else for a little bit. And you might not be able to provide permanent capacity to take them in, but maybe you do have the capacity and the space to offer a temporary place for them to live. You can help look for placement for animals. And so, sanctuaries often get rescue requests all the time. And if you are at capacity, maybe you shift your focus from who can we take in to where can we responsibly place this animal in need and helping to vet potential good homes. And finally, one that's really a really important thing that you can do, even if you're at capacity, is you can see how you can help residents or help animals where they currently live. This isn't always feasible, but for instance, sometimes people just go through hard times and maybe they just need a little bit of extra help. Maybe they need a little bit extra education. Maybe they just need help, with some food or supplies to just get them through a little bit of a tough time. So rather than fully, rehoming this animal or trying to bring them into your sanctuary, you can help provide a really solid home for them where they are, just with a little bit of support or training or education, or even a little bit of financial support so that the animal gets to stay where they are and the caregiver gets to continue developing a really healthy relationship with them. Obviously, that's not always going to be possible, but there are many cases where sanctuaries get intake requests from otherwise really caring people that just might not have, they might just need a little help. And so that's something that's a helpful way that you can be a capacity, but you can still be helping animals. So let's shift gears for a little bit and talk about raising money. I would say that raising money is one of the most challenging topics for many people who run animal sanctuaries or animal organizations, because funding is always going to be, going back to capacity, one of those really crucial avenues of capacity, and what will really enable you to provide the best care for residents or expand your capacity and provide more care for residents or get more staff. Fundraising is just a really important part of that. So there's a lot of different ways that sanctuaries can responsibly and ethically fundraise. We have a great list on our website, which is how to raise money for your animal sanctuary. But we just wanted to talk about some of the interesting ways that sanctuaries are raising money, maybe beyond some of the more typical ones. So one way that a lot of people talk about raising money for their sanctuary for individual residents is sponsorships. And you might have heard of sponsorships. You might have decided that it's something that you want to learn more about. Sponsorships can be a really great way to connect individual humans with individual residents and really connect their stories and provide updates. And so if somebody has a really individual relationship with a resident, a sponsorship is a really great way of fostering that relationship and strengthening a person's relationship to the sanctuary as a whole. If you are going to do sponsorships, sometimes things you have to know about is you might be offering different updates or specific things that that individual being sponsored gets. So that might increase just your responsibilities in order to responsibly provide that as a fundraising channel. It's also important to know that you need to be really careful with your wording depending on where you are in the world, because if, for instance, your sponsorship says that that funding goes only to that resident, you've actually might have restricted your funding from being able to use it for anyone else in an ethical manner. So you might want to be just really careful with your wording, and maybe you say, our sponsorship funding helps this resident in addition to other residents at the sanctuary, just to be really clear, unless your sponsorship indeed is only to support that individual resident. On top of sponsorships, workshops and classes are a really great way to bring in additional funding, but also just build community. So, there's as many workshops and classes as there are, people with interests. So a workshop at a class could be something like, maybe a great woodworker or like a crafter, and you can kind of work some kind of workshop in that way. Maybe you could do like a baking workshop or a cooking workshop or a gardening workshop. So really just thinking about who's in your community, who can you build a relationship with, and how can you leverage those relationships in a way to offer something to the community that will both be informative and interesting, but also help create a relationship with the sanctuary and maybe do some fundraising in the meanwhile. And events, right now might be a little bit challenging for obvious reasons, but I just wanted to talk about some specific kinds of events. A donated item yard sale is like a really great way that you can raise money, because you can ask your community, hey, do you have some like really like, you know, things that they don't need anymore? And you can turn that in directly into donations for your sanctuary. It can be like a really fun event, and it's relatively low on the scale of things that you need to, organizing obviously always takes time, but doing a yard sale is a fairly low key way of being able to raise money, and it can be interesting, and it can get a lot of interest in your sanctuary. Again, right now it might not be the best time for that kind of thing, but also a bake sale. You're getting stuff donated to you, and then you're turning that into donations, or you could combine events like that. And going back to the yard sale, some sanctuaries and organizations actually have started entire thrift stores separately from their organization, maybe in town if they're kind of away from town. And that thrift store directly financially supports the sanctuary. And that can be really successful. Obviously, that is kind of a next level thing. It requires a lot of extra planning. It requires, a whole lot of stuff, but it just shows that sanctuaries you can really scale and envision kind of so many different ways of being able to raise money for your organization beyond just the typical direct appeal. And the last one I wanted to talk about is naming rights, because naming rights is something that I think, maybe some bigger organizations might get involved with, but it's also a really helpful tool for sanctuaries of any size, as long as you kind of tackle it in a responsible way and think through what you're trying to achieve with it. So by naming rights, I mean, putting a plaque on a building or in like a brick garden with names on them, or maybe like you sponsor a really nice bench that overlooks a really peaceful area, and giving people for financial donations, allowing them to have their name on that. And there's a lot of best practices online that you can learn about that. There's actually a fair bit of things to think about, like thinking about, well, how much of a donation should one have to give for these things? You have limited things you can actually put a name on. And is it going to be a permanent named thing, or is it going to be something that maybe you offer for like a 5-year donation? So these are all things that you should really think about. But putting a name on a building can be, if you do it really responsibly and think about what you're trying to achieve with it, it can be a really great way to drum up interest in fundraising and also to demonstrate gratitude to supporters. So that's what I had to say about those things. If y'all have any questions about capacity or ways to raise money, feel free to put them in the chat. And does anyone else on the team have anything to say about these things? I know it was a lot for a Sunday afternoon, so let us continue.
Okay, this is where I pick up. And I'll warn you, I get really excited about talking about enrichment. So something I've been working on or, learning about for years and years. And so and in a sanctuary environment, I think enrichment is like really part of everything, part of that daily. There's a few things I'd like to touch base on before we actually get into things. Is one, enrichment doesn't have to be expensive. That is one thing that a lot of individuals or sanctuaries are like, how can we? So we have a number of like resources for individuals, of individual species on the site, and you can find some extra ideas there, and you can see how inexpensive some of them are. But I did want to note that, because that is a thing that I know is sometimes a reaction to that. Also, one of the great things about enrichment is creating an environment like this that is dynamic and engaging for residents. It can like lower stress levels, and now no doubt know that chronic stress levels can prevent healing. It can lower immune systems and make it easier to catch illnesses. So like enrichment can be a big part of helping ensure happy, healthy residents. So And then one thing that I think is almost never mentioned is that enrichment can be really enriching for care staff. And the care staff obviously working so hard in and out every day, and there are difficult things that you have to navigate. And when you get a moment to stop and think about what, you know, an individual you care for might like, you get to learn more about them. It can create a stronger bond between you and the residents, while also like, if you're doing something scent wise, you know, they may get enrichment from that. But if you're in the middle of a really intense day that you've been doing all these things, and you get a moment where you get to stop and you're like, oh, this is going to do a little basil here, a little lavender thing for them to smell here. You're also getting to smell those things, which can be, you know, it's just a nice bonus there to think about. So, but we'll move on. Yeah, okay, so important aspect of general care. This is a big one that we really want to change the idea of what enrichment is. So often it's thought of as just like this very far off thing, which is like, if we can figure something out in the future, then maybe we can incorporate this, but it is doable. And if we can create kind of this, you know, mindset that it is a part of everything. And the way I kind of think about it is kind of a survive versus thrive mentality. Like often we do a lot like we need and they need water, like, you know, so yes, there are certain basic things where like they need to survive, but also like that's not what a sanctuary really is. It's really about, you know, individuals thriving and giving them a good life. And so that is a very important aspect, is like, let's do this as individual, let's do this as general care. Start thinking about it in terms of that as you would anything else that has to be a part of their care. Okay, types of enrichment. I know many people are like, oh, so like food, or, you know, like, because food is very enriching for me. So it's often the first thing I think about too. So, but there are actually several types or multiple types. The first one is kind of obvious. You have social enrichment, which a lot of, you know, species are social and they require like, you know, contact and connection with others, and particularly of their species. But also there are instances that I'm sure you've run into where someone has to be separated temporarily due to injury or illness, or during like quarantine when they're coming in, they might be alone. Well, there are ways that we'll show a few examples of below of how that might affect an individual that can't engage in a social environment normally for a time. And then you have physical enrichment. And physical enrichment is super important. And I think it could be really provide a base for everything else to be built on. And Tara's going to kind of really expound on that with a really great way of thinking about it. But basically it refers to like, what is their environment made up of? Like you have goats, like does their environment have like you know, big mounds or something for them to hop up onto, or because that's a goat thing, you know? So you think about things. Do waterfowl residents have access to water, you know, like that they can play in and whatnot? And so those are kind of the aspects of physical enrichment. Nutritional enrichment, that's, yes, we all know treats. We all love them. We really get that one really well. But it's not just what you offer, it's how you offer it too. That can be really important. Sensory enrichment is a lot of fun. It covers the senses, you know, visual enrichment, auditory enrichment, olfactory enrichment, and touch, so tactile enrichment. And then last is cognitive enrichment, which is anything that's really engaging their brain, their mind, you know, to explore, curiosity, solving problems, learning new things. And you'll notice that a lot of these overlap. So which is great. You get like a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 kind of like situation. So if you're planning something cognitively here with like a puzzle feeder or something, you're also getting tactile, you know, enrichment as well. If something in there is scented, you can, I mean, like there's so much that you can put in that kind of overlaps. So Okay, so we've covered the types that exist, and this is now incorporating enrichment. It really is easier than you think, and there are a few things to think about first, which one is like species specific. You really need to do your research about the species and what makes sense for them as a species, but you can't stop there because everyone's an individual and everyone has their preferences and everyone has their histories, and many will have some difficult histories where certain things may not be enriching for them. And so not only is it important to do your research for the species you're caring for, it's important that you really pay attention and consider the individual as well. And then when you're done doing that research, you can create a plan of enrichment that makes sense for them as a species and as an individual, if where that's possible. A lot of times you have groups, but often there's like a lot of positive things, but you can learn if there's something that is aversive to someone in that group, and then you can make adjustments. So you create that plan, you implement that plan or that enrichment you're offering. And when you do that, then you need to observe and record that information. And based on what that information is, you can either like discard that, like, well, no, they do not like the boxes with, like herbs in them or something. Okay, now we know. And so you can discard it, or you can make adjustments to make it work a little better, or you can just be like, this was great, we are going to incorporate this. And that will allow you to start building little schedules that can be part of their weekly routines. And it can be like exciting for everyone involved. So let's look at some examples. Okay, social enrichment. This is where I was talking about, like, okay, normally, like, yes, everyone should have companions of preferably of their own species, but also that can't happen all the time. Quarantine, injury, things like that, or even like an upset in the group dynamics that require a little rearranging. During that time, you can still provide forms of social enrichment that can help kind of fill that need temporarily. And in this case, we have a really sweet calf cuddling up next to a really big teddy bear, and just having something in their environment that can kind of mimic being with another, being can be helpful. Then we have another example, and mirrors can also do this for many species and many individuals, though you'll want to pay attention because sometimes some individuals may be like, excuse me, who is this person in my space? I don't like you. And, so you got to pay attention. But that can be really enriching, just to be able to see, someone that is like a companion to you. It does have an effect for many that can be positive. So, and then nutritional enrichment, which, yes, treats. Everyone loves the treats. So, but there's lots of different ways. If you have a physically enriching environment that Tara is going to go into, sometimes it comes along with nutritional enrichment. There may be plants that are safe to the residents that are also interesting, that provide, like tasty little nibbles that they get to check out and like in a very natural way. But you can't always have supernatural. So then you, I love these. So I don't know if anyone had the experience of like fall, like harvest pumpkin situation or post Halloween. But this is a great thing. That's one that can be really inexpensive because you can ask your community to just drop off pumpkins. And then you can provide these to your pig residents, like right here, really excited. And it's really interesting. It's different textures, different smells, but also super tasty. Okay, and then here's another look. Here is sometimes just offering something that's different, something that just isn't part of what they normally receive, can be really, like as everyone knows, like when you get to eat something that's like, oh, I haven't had this before, but it's really great. And also in like winter spaces, or not winter, but summer spaces, you can go and trying to think. So you can go and like freeze some of these things, and so they can go through them and, use them and cool off at the same time. And it takes longer for them to get to them. So there's lots of like ways to go about it. And then for, here's an example for waterfowl. This is a great way of like showing how you can incorporate nutritional enrichment in a way that encourages like exploration and movement and natural foraging behaviors, which you don't always get if you like offer treats, but you just like offer them in a little like pan or just on the ground, even like thinking about that species again and thinking about what would be enriching for them. And this is a really great example of that. And then of course, this is a very popular one. So being able to hang things like this, like cabbage enrichment, or you can make little garlands with different things for, you know, like chickens to nibble on. And it just shows an example of, or it shows the variety that you can really come up with, which I can't even begin to really cover, but you get the idea that there are many different ways that you can provide nutritional enrichment. And then sensory enrichment, which here we're looking at some olfactory enrichment, which so you have some really good smelling basil there, which I really love. And you can like place things around the environment. You can add different scents. You can use safe spritzes and so on around that environment that are interesting, and change it up and just provide a, you know, a dynamic space to live in. And here, yes, there are actually many studies that exist that indicate that chickens prefer color over black and white. They prefer moving screens or images over like static images. And it can keep, you know, like individuals entertained for quite some time. And you can do this in multiple different ways. But if you have an individual that's like in a sling and needs temporary, you know, isolation, then setting them up with like cartoons or even like a really interesting screensaver can be good enrichment. So, and here's some really lovely, really sweet sensory enrichment, which is also social. It's like all these things. But, you know, even having someone come in and like read to a resident or talk with them in a way that's just really like sitting and taking a minute and being with them is another type of like auditory enrichment that many people don't think of. And if you're lucky, if any of you are very talented or have talented volunteers that can play an instrument, or maybe they like are great at singing or something, that can be a really exciting, enriching experience, as can like, you know, low sound classical music. But it's really cool if you're able to actually play for them, which is pretty exciting. Of course, if I was singing, it probably wouldn't be enriching. So, but yeah, let's move on. And then here's another example, which you're talking about touch, tactile, just being able to go through and touch different things in their environment that have different textures is really interesting. It can be really boring sometimes if like this is all that you have is this one thing, and then you add like brushes like this. It's exciting, and it's something that they can interact with themselves. Like they can go to it, and also encourages exploration behavior, and that's all great. And of course, toys. You have toys that can be sensory enrichment too, and really great. I know that balls have been really exciting for a number of species and individuals, and it can be a lot of fun to watch. But there are other, for different species, there's other types of kind of objects, and like actual objects that are the enrichment itself for them to like manipulate, and really great form. And here, like you have an old Christmas tree or something like that. Just think of what all those different things we're looking at feel like to your hands, or what it would feel like on your face. Like it just makes your environment more interesting, and it makes their environment more interesting too. And here is an example too of like physical enrichment, but also feeling the ground is one thing, and you're used to that. You have grass, maybe you have a little dirt over here, but even the feel of something like these half barrels, like beneath your hooves, and even like the sounds that they make, which can, be auditory, and like those little things do make a difference. They can really provide a more dynamic environment. cognitive enrichment. So this is fun. And once again, a lot of things overlap, but here you have a sweet bun who is figuring out how to find their food, their treats through a puzzle feeder. So this is important. Like if you're going to, you need to learn about the individual first if you're considering making it to where that's how they get their main food too. So you have to make sure they're able to get that. And so observation is really important. But it can be really neat that really engages one's mind to try and figure out and helps them spend more time, you know, engaged in like foraging behavior, because so often when you're, you know, we do the best we can, but when you are in a confined space, you're not going to be able to eat the same way that you would eat if you had, you know, different options there. So increasing the amount of time, like for rabbits, can be really important. Here's a sheep, you know, like version of that. There's like a hole here and you have to figure out how to manipulate it so trees fall out. And it looks like it's pretty interesting for everyone there. And then we have physical enrichment. This is an example, really great for goats. You see that they're like, there's an upper level, there's things for them here to jump on and climb on. It's very simple, but it's very important. And here, obviously, it's a similar idea, but having just a pallet is not going to be the thing that these roosters want. But having varied perches at different heights, that can all be a really important part of physical enrichment. In another example, with this bun has an entire castle, which is really cool. And like a whole like tunnel system. So they can really, they need to be able to hide if they want that. They need to be able to feel like they can kind of burrow in, and they, you know, go through tunnels like it was a warren. And yeah, so this looks different for every species. And then we have, so as you can tell, like your rabbit resident might not be appreciative of this enrichment, right? So this is where you're like, oh, but clearly here, this is very enriching for many pig residents. And once again, we talked about that a little bit, like how like you have like waterfowl species. Well, water is part of the, you know, designation of them. And so like that's an important thing to consider for physical enrichment. And it just shows examples of how different that physical enrichment looks for different species. And one thing I want to mention for all of this, like I'll leave you with this thought too, is like one of the reasons it's so important to consider the individuals and well also the species at individual, because you can't just be like, okay, chickens like this and they like to perch. Well, are they large breed chickens? Are they chickens are like maybe older and have a harder time moving around? Because then high perches aren't a good part of physical enrichment. So it's like it goes into more of that, and Tara's going to cover that. But anyway, that's my tiny bit of talking about enrichment. So I hope that it was it'll be exciting for you to explore at your sanctuary too.
Okay, so expanding a little bit on physical enrichment, I'm going to talk about this design process that we're calling animal-centered design, which is basically taking physical enrichment to the next level and sort of rethinking what a living space should look like for sanctuary residents. I don't know about anyone on this call, but I know for me, I didn't even necessarily realize it until I started exploring this topic more, but I certainly had this idea in my brain about what a sanctuary looked like that cared for farmed animals. And I had this idea of a farm, you know, not the farm that we all know is what what farms are, but like what you wished a farm was when you were little, sort of, you know, this pastoral scene. And so animal-centered design is sort of thinking about, is that what is the best for every species that we're caring for? And are there ways that we can either create a different sort of living space or add elements that sort of change the living spaces that we currently offer. I want to mention that this animal-centered design is something that I first heard from the folks over at Piedmont Farm Animal Refuge. And you'll see in the pictures that are incorporated in this part of the presentation that there are just a handful of sanctuaries that we're showing. And that is in no way reflective of the fact that there aren't more sanctuaries doing this. I think there are lots of places that might hear like, oh, animal-centered design, what is that? And then when they hear about it, they're like, oh, we do that. Like, I didn't know we were doing that. That's incredible. So I don't want this to seem like, here are the 3 sanctuaries who do this, or if you don't call it animal-centered design, it's not. But we just picked a few photos from the people that we worked with to do our introductory resource on this topic to give you some examples. And the basic idea behind animal-centered design is that, yes, providing shelter from the elements is important, and providing protection from predators is important. And both of those things are non-negotiables. Like, those absolutely have to happen. But can you go beyond that to create a space that really is unique and reflective of who your residents are? And the folks at Piedmont describe it as creating a space that the animals would choose for themselves, or would create for themselves if they could. So in order to do that, you have to really understand who they are, which Amber already talked about with enrichment. So you need to understand who they are as a species, maybe like the implications of their breed, and then of course who they are as individuals. But sometimes when you're building, you can do animal-centered design on an existing space and add elements, but you can also build with animal-centered design in mind. So in some cases, you might be building for hypothetical residents, like, we are going to start rescuing chickens, and therefore we need to build a space for chickens before we can welcome them to our sanctuary. So you might be building more for like chickens as a species, and then making changes here and there as you get to know the individuals. So it's really a process that doesn't stop, much like enrichment, where you're looking and assessing and observing and making changes as you need to. So in order to start with animal-centered design, you have to understand who the living space is going to be for. And so there are lots of ways that you can do this, research you can do, lots of questions you should ask yourself, but here are some important ones. And this is part of the design process that Piedmont Farm Animal Refuge asks themselves when they're building a space. So think about, as a species, what makes them feel safe? So you saw the picture of the rabbit with like the tunnel. Like, a rabbit might want cover and an area where they can hide. That might not be the same thing that a cow wants or a goat wants. So think about, what it is that they need to feel safe. And I want to point out that this is different. There's overlap, but this isn't exactly the same as providing protection from predators. You can have a space for rabbits, chickens that is completely covered, with buried fencing, and is, as impenetrable as you can make it. And, looking at the space, the residents who live here are safe. That doesn't mean that they're going to feel safe in that space, because that cover that you've provided, if it's like, a hardware cloth roof or aviary netting, that doesn't create the same coverage that might make them feel safe of being under something, because it has all the holes. So this is really thinking beyond predator proofing and like, what is going to give them a sense of safety? And then also think about what makes them happy. Pigs are happy in mud. A rabbit might not be happy in mud. Goats like to get up high. Think about these things that brings this members of this species joy. And of course, individuals are going to have different preferences, but this is the broader, like, what sorts of things should we incorporate into this space? Also think about who their ancestors are, and what sorts of environments they live in, if they're still alive, or what environments did they live in. So a good example thinking about this is chickens. We know that they are descendants of red jungle fowl, who live in forested areas. And yet so much of the time when you see pictures of chickens living, you know, wherever, like on farms, you know, they're in this like open pasture setting, which isn't exactly reflective of maybe what would make them feel safe or where they're going to exhibit natural behaviors. And then the last one is, you know, if members of this species go feral, where do they go and what do they do? So again, like what is going to be a natural environment for them? And I think Amber raised an important point that like, you don't necessarily have to create a super perfectly natural environment. These are just like ideas. You can create something that gives them the opportunity to exhibit behaviors they would exhibit in a natural environment without it totally looking like, you know, exactly like a natural setting. So we'll look at some, before we look at some examples, I just want to reiterate that animal-centered design, it's really a process. It's not, I never took architecture, so this might not be, I might not be using a good example, but it's not like, oh, look, there's an animal-centered design barn. And there's, it's not so much that you look at something that's like, that looks like animal-centered design. It's the process that goes into it. And so it can look like all sorts of different things. Sometimes it looks exactly like, you know, a barn, like a barn that you could pick up and put somewhere else and be like, oh, look, it's like that, you know, fairy tale farm that I thought about as a kid. And other times you're like, oh, animals live there? Like that doesn't even look like something that I would have pictured for a sanctuary. So the possibilities are really endless. It's the thought that goes into the space that you're creating. So we'll look at a few examples. We can go to the next slide. So first we'll look at some building design. So this is the turkey and chicken, or one of the turkey and chicken structures at Piedmont Farm Animal Refuge. And this is what I said, like when I saw this and some of their other structures, I was like, wow, like I've never really seen anything quite like that. So here's an example of something that might look a bit outside of the box. So Piedmont is located in North Carolina. It gets hot down there, gets humid down there. Turkeys and chickens can overheat. Birds can be very vulnerable to respiratory illness if it gets too humid and steamy. And so with all of that in mind, when they built this structure, they built it so that that fourth wall is actually on hinges and can open up so that you're opening up that whole wall to bring in airflow and light, and then also creating a cool covered area where they can feed everybody outside, but still have it under the cover of that roof. And then at night, they can close that down and it seals up tight so that it is still a predator-proof space overnight. We can look at the next one. So this looks a little bit more familiar to me in terms of spaces that I've seen for chickens. But when you look at the different elements of the space and hear the thought behind them, that's where it starts to be a bit different. So this is at Triangle Chicken Advocates, also in North Carolina. And this is their rooster flock barn. And so TCA actually cares for a rooster flock of about 30 roosters, which is, it's a lot of roosters in one flock. And so creating healthy group dynamics was really important so that they could safely house that number of roosters. So if you see on the left side of the screen, there's that big slider. They have that slider, or a slider like that, that can go over every window, which is on, they have the windows on 3 sides of the barn. And so that way at night they can cover that. And then in the morning when it starts getting like a little bit light out and everybody starts waking up before they're opened up for the day, it keeps everybody a bit more subdued. So you don't have that like morning rush of like, you know, everyone's getting really active and they're enclosed in this space, which could lead to issues with confrontations and things like that. It's also a massive barn for the number of birds. Like you wouldn't necessarily need a space this large if it was 1 rooster and 29 hens. So this space actually provides 20 square feet of space per rooster. And again, that was intentional so that there was enough space for everyone to carve out their own space indoors. And also, you know, if there were any tensions, people were able to leave, you know, like de-escalate and go somewhere else without feeling cornered and trapped with each other. And then you can see in the doorway, there's a staircase, which we'll look at more closely in the next photo. I thought this was a cool thing. So this staircase is a great roosting area at night, but it also leads to one of two loft areas in the space. So not only do you have the floor space, there are also these elevated spaces, which chickens tend to like elevated spaces. And one of the things that the folks over at TCA mentioned is in working with these large groups of roosters, they found that they actually broke off into smaller groups. So, you know, there might be a group of like 3 or 6 that pretty consistently hang out together. And so they wanted to create a space where those smaller groups could carve out their own space within the indoor space. And these lofts are a great way to do that because they're so separate from the other spaces. We can look at the next slide. This is back to Piedmont Farm Animal Refuge. So this is their duck house, and they have goose living areas that look just like this as well. And so these are built again with like water as like the main feature. So they're built right onto the pond so that there's not a whole lot of separation between the indoor space and the outdoor space. And I thought this was cool. I don't know if anyone else has had a similar experience as this, but when I was a caregiver for over a decade, and I always found it really interesting that the ducks and the geese were so often just not in their living space. And maybe it's because the living space was boring. I don't know. In hindsight, maybe that's what it was. But like they were always outside or on the water. And so I'm interested to know, like having it this close, like are they indoors a little bit more? Because it just seems like those home design shows where you're like, we want to bring the outdoor in, and like that's what this is. So I'm told that the ducks spend most of their time on that porch, which is also south facing, so it warms up in the winter and it's a nice place for them to sun themselves, and they love using it as a diving board to jump right into the water. Okay, on to the next one, and this is Piedmont's goat barn. All of their barns are built with passive solar, which again, I realize that like if you already have barns, no one's saying like put passive solar in, like no big deal, just like rotate it. These are really just ideas. Like it's a concept, and you can find different ways to either build using this design process or even incorporating elements into your space. Some elements you're maybe not going to incorporate, but you can still incorporate ideas. So this barn is built with passive solar, which are those big windows. And then if you look on the left, you see lofts. And if I was just glancing at this picture, I'd be like, oh yeah, like I've been in a goat barn that had storage lofts, like of course. No, this is their living space. Those lofts are actually for them, which we'll look at in the next slide. So these are the lofts up close. And because it's south facing with those windows, that masonry wall in the background actually soaks up sun during the day, and then at night releases it. And goats tend to prefer warmth over the cold, you know, like sometimes they need a ton of coats in the winter. So they'll sleep near this wall in the winter, which will release heat and help keep the space cool. And then it's also super fun for them. So I really had never thought about incorporating the elevated spaces into the indoors. Like I've always thought like, oh yeah, like in a goat, you know, pasture, you should have those elevated spaces that Amber showed, but this is a cool way to show that you can try to incorporate them into the indoors as well. And then I think we're on to outdoor spaces. So this is a picture from the pig preserve located in Tennessee. And they were like really invested. I don't think they were calling it animal-centered design necessarily, but they were really invested in this idea of creating a natural space for their pig residents that was reflective of, you know, where they would live if they were on their own, and gave them the opportunity to exhibit, you know, natural behaviors. And so they have 100 acres in Tennessee. And when they were looking for this property, they really had certain things that they wanted ponds and streams, and they wanted their pigs to have forested areas. And then there are also open grassy areas. So on this 100 acres, I thought this was just fascinating. They have 150 to 170 pigs, depending on like their resident population, living together on this giant space, and they get to choose where they want to live. And then the humans will actually move or build a structure where the pigs carve out, the different groups carve out their territory. And so that just totally changes the type of dynamic that I think this group of pigs have. And as someone who has done my fair share of pig introductions, rooster introductions, seeing how the living space affects group dynamics in talking to the people at the pig preserve and triangle chicken advocates, it's something that I totally was overlooking. But it can have such an impact if they have this enriching dynamic space and the choice, like enough options where they can choose where they're going to be, who they're going to spend their time with, is totally different than a space, even if you're incorporating, I don't want to say you're just keeping them in barren spaces, even if you're incorporating these like cool elements, if they still don't have the same choices that come with just like more space and more things to do, it's just really going to impact group dynamics. So that's another important reason to think about, the spaces that you're creating for everyone. And we can look at, this is again, Triangle Chicken Advocates and their rooster flock. So I said in the beginning that it's a process. So it's not just like, oh, we built this thing, it's done. And like, we thought about all the things that you need as chickens. When the humans at Triangle Chicken Advocates built their rooster area, the outdoor space is 1.5 acres, and a good portion of that is wooded, which makes perfect sense. They're descendants of jungle fowl. Chickens really do, if you spend some time watching them, they really do, a lot of them seem to prefer being able to be under things, having things over them. It gives them a feeling of safety from aerial predators. And so the thinking that, oh, the wooded area will be perfect for them, of course. One of the things that the humans there noticed was the roosters weren't using the wooded area as much as they thought that they would. And they would really only venture out there when the humans were out there. They really preferred staying closer to their living space. Now they could argue and be like, but it's the woods, like you should want that. It doesn't matter. It's sort of like what Amber was saying with enrichment. Like if they're not receiving it the way that you intended it to be, it doesn't matter. Like it's still not what they want or need. And so what the humans did was they started to find ways in the space closer to the barn to add those elements of cover that the woods provide, but they weren't really utilizing as frequently. So you really are always needing to look. And the other thing is, most of us, if you're creating a living space and you're running a sanctuary that hopefully is going to be around for decades, the individuals living in those spaces, first of all, those individuals are going to change, as they age. The things that they were utilizing or enjoying, they might not be able to use in the same way. So you might have to make some changes. Or you might find that you bring in different residents over the years who just are like, this isn't for me. And so you can't be like, but it's animal-centered design, I did it. You really have to look at the individuals and make the changes that they need, because again, it's the idea, it's giving them that space that's dynamic, that reflects who they are and that they're really utilizing. Because if they're not using it, there's no point to it. Ready for the last outdoor slide. Okay, so this is Oliver and Friends in Oklahoma. And this is an example of, a really cool natural rock formation that they have on their property, which, if I was purchasing this property to start a sanctuary, I would see this and be like, goats. Like, I don't know who I was originally planning on rescuing, but goats need this rock structure and are probably going to use it in a different way than if you put, pigs out here or some other species. So again, your elevated areas might be something really like natural like this, but you can also get creative and build these things if you just don't have these spaces. Okay. the point of this wasn't to be like, look at these things, I bet you can't do it. It can get really overwhelming to look at these. And that's not the point. The point is to give you some ideas of things that you might be able to do if you're looking for ways to incorporate animal-centered design into your living spaces. So of course, like I said, with the rock formation, there's only so much you can do. Like your space, unless you're looking for a property right now, like your space is your space, and your barns might be your barns, and you're not going to all of a sudden like, like pick it up and turn it and be like, let's add passive solar. But that doesn't mean that you can't incorporate elements of animal-centered design. So think back to those initial questions and then find little manageable ways that you can add elements that will reflect who your residents are and will give them opportunities to exhibit natural behaviors. So this little graphic on the side, you might not, if you don't have woods on your property, you can't all of a sudden tomorrow be like, you know what, I'm going to add a forest. It's just, 30 years you'll have a forest for someone, but not right now. But maybe you can add other plants. It doesn't have to be that chickens have to have a forest, but are there other ways that you can add cover and give them that same feel? So think about like, okay, so the forest is where like their ancestors live. What does the forest give them? How do they feel in the forest? Okay, how can I recreate that minus the forest? So it might be with plants, maybe you add plants to their living space, either potted plants or actually like planted in the ground. The nice thing about potted plants is, you can move them, you can bring them in the winter, which I guess is a good or a bad, depending on your on your setup. But as long as you have plants that are safe for them, then that is a way for them to maybe have nice little like vegetated areas they can get under. But it doesn't have to be plants. Maybe you put up tarps. Maybe you add, I've seen at Chicken Run Rescue, they use this cool corrugated metal, it's like roofing material, and they bend it and they create these long tunnels that their chickens love to go under, and then they feel safe and they can go on top of. It's a nice elevated space. So get creative. It's more thinking about like, what do I want them to do and feel, and how can I add that to the space, no matter how big, how small, what your budget is. There should be certain ways that you can incorporate some of these spaces. And much like enrichment, I think it can feel overwhelming or like we don't have the resources or the time or things, but it really is so much more than like, but look at how pretty their space is. It's going to totally impact the dynamics of the group. And so if your goal is to be able to rescue, more individuals or have bigger groups living together, you're really going to need to look at the dynamics of the group to make sure everybody is healthy and happy and safe. And so you're going to want to think about those living spaces because it's more, it impacts them so much more than just, they enjoy doing these different things. So we have a whole resource on it if you want to read more about it. And then, want to learn more? Here's our website. Everything on our website is free. We've got a ton of art resources about all the topics we covered today, plus a lot of other stuff on there.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions for any of us about any of this or anything else you want us to talk about, we'll be around a little bit for Q&A. You can ask us a question, you can put it in the chat. I saw one question come up from earlier. Do organizations typically make money off of selling merch? Yes, merch can be complicated because you have to design the merch, you have to find somebody to, print it or make sure you do quality control. And maybe you're going to do like print on demand versus keeping an inventory. And then you have to know about whether you need to collect taxes for it. So merch can be complicated, but yeah, a lot of sanctuaries do. How much money they make based on merch and how much that affects their fundraising strategies depends on every organization. Some do a lot more than others. And all of these fundraising channels, usually you need to have a really diverse portfolio of them. So, like I said, on our article in the chat, resource in the chat, how to raise money, we've got a big list but it's going to be a different mix for everybody depending on a lot of things.